Jennifer Lowe, Director of Programs and Strategic Planning for the Supreme Court Historical Society. I'm delighted to welcome you to our virtual platform for today's program on Justice Robert H. Jackson. Our speaker today is John Q. Barrett. He is the Benjamin N. Cardozo Professor of Law at St. John's University School of Law. He is also the Elizabeth C. Lena Fellow at the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. He is a graduate of Georgetown University and Harvard Law School. He served as a law clerk to Judge A. Leon Higginbotham of the United States Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. Professor Barrett is writing a biography of the late Supreme Court Justice and Nuremberg prosecutor, Robert H. Jackson. He is also the man behind the Jackson List, which sends essays regarding Justice Jackson and related topics to over 100,000 readers around the world. I could continue to list Professor Barrett's many accomplishments, but it would leave no time for his lecture and conversation. I will simply note that he has been a longtime friend and contributor to the Supreme Court Historical Society, and we are delighted to have him with us today. We will be taking questions from the audience. Please share your questions in the Q&A box on your Zoom screen, and we will work to get to as many as possible. Professor Barrett, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Jennifer, and good afternoon. I'm grateful to the Historical Society for this opportunity and for all of its great work. Of course, to the justices who are in the background and above the Historical Society, and particularly to you, Jennifer, for the program's work. I am doing an 80th anniversary talk here because in September 1945, Justice Robert Jackson was embarking on what became his year away from the Supreme Court as chief U.S. prosecutor of Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg. But he sort of popped back into the court for a week that really falls on these dates 80 years ago. So I'm going to get to that moment, but this is the path ahead. I'm going to briefly talk about Jackson, introduce him. Then second, I'm going to talk about the non-court appointment that he accepted in April 1945 and what he was doing on that other job, his prosecute the Nazis job, from April until August of 1945. Third, I'm going to focus in, as I said, on the September 1945 return to Washington, D.C., physical return to the Supreme Court chambers, but not at all to court work. Fourth, I'm going to go forward when he leaves Washington that September. He quickly is in Nuremberg, and I will describe the Nuremberg trial process that is the rest of his next 12 months. Fifth, I'm going to comment on and describe how the court was in Jackson's absence. And sixth, I'll describe Nuremberg's conclusion and Jackson's return to the court. I also want to leave a little time for some slides, and as Jennifer said, I will welcome your questions. So to begin, let me tell you about a letter. It was written on September 17, 1945, by a lawyer from Camden, New Jersey, named Elmer Van Name. He wrote this letter to the new President of the United States, Harry Truman. And the gist of the letter, quoting Mr. Van Name, was that he thought Robert Jackson should be requested to resign from the Supreme Court for neglect of duty. Now, there's no indication that President Truman himself received this letter to the White House. There's no sign that Mr. Van Name received a reply from anybody at the White House. And that makes sense at a basic level, because what Robert Jackson was up to in September of 1945 was Harry Truman's doing. It was a presidential appointment of a Supreme Court justice to perform a national executive branch task. And it was Truman's strong preference that Jackson be the face of the United States in that big project. Jackson had been gone by September of 1945 from the United States since June 18. So he'd been gone about 3 months until his brief September return. And he was gone from the court for a full year. Let me turn to Jackson himself and briefly introduce him. He's an amazing and huge life. My Jackson List archive, his book, That Man, and my introduction. Lots of places have biographical information. He was born on a family farm in 1892 in rural northwestern Pennsylvania, Spring Creek in Warren County. When he was a boy, the family moved above the New York state line, and he grew up there in a little village called Frewsburg. He ended up graduating from the Frewsburg High School and then doing one more year in the bigger city north of Frewsburg as a second senior year of high school in Jamestown, New York. And then he became a law apprentice at age 18. He never attended college. He apprenticed for a year, attended law school for a year, returned to apprenticing for a year, and at age 21 became a member of the New York Bar and a practicing lawyer. His base was Western New York State, first Jamestown, then Buffalo, then back to Jamestown, and soon across the state, a lot in Albany, some in New York City. He also became a significant lawyer in national bar circles, oil and gas work from Pennsylvania and New York, the New York State Bar Association, the American Bar Association, the American Law Institute. He was making a mark. He was also a Democrat, and he had an acquaintance which ripened into political support and a friendship with Franklin Roosevelt. And that, when Roosevelt becomes president, is what pulls Jackson to Washington. In 1934, he has his first presidential appointment as the general counsel in the Bureau of Revenue in the Treasury Department. And then 2 years later, he moves over to DOJ, where he is an assistant attorney general, first heads the tax division, then the antitrust division. Then he's Solicitor General of the United States and arguing before the Supreme Court for 2 years, about 40 cases and brilliant advocacy. He becomes Attorney General of the United States in 1940, and after 18 months in that job, he's appointed to the court in July of 1941. Jackson at that point is 49 years old. So this is a meteoric rise. He then spends 2 years on the court and begins to use the pen that is so distinctive, the writing that is so beautiful. He writes Wickard versus Filburn. He writes the court's opinion in West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett. But he's in a bit of a backwater because Pearl Harbor comes 6 months after his appointment, and he becomes quite disillusioned by the court. He thinks a number of his colleagues are not on the up and up, that their behavior is political more than judicial, that they're pre-committed, and he gets nearly to the point of quitting the court in 1943, 1944. He negotiates a partnership with a big New York law firm that would have been renamed Jackson, Simpson, Thatcher. But at the last minute, he pulls back and decides to stay put. And then in April 1945, on a Tuesday afternoon, his phone rings. It's Sam Rosenman, the White House counsel to the new president, Harry Truman, and he says he has something to discuss. Can he come up to the court and talk to Jackson? And that is President Truman's request that Jackson represent the United States in the commitment that the Allies had made during the war after their victory to hold the Nazi arch criminals accountable in an international criminal trial process. Jackson accepts that job. He does not consult Chief Justice Harlan Fiske Stone, whom he was quite close to. He does not consult his close friend Felix Frankfurter, later telling him he knew Felix would say no. He just says yes. In part, it's a separation from a place he wasn't loving. In part, it's a fit on the calendar because the court is in late April heading towards its summer recess. In part, it's a sales pitch. He's told it's kind of a turnkey job and it just needs a chief prosecutor. And in part, of course, it's very appealing to his ego. He's being asked to prosecute Adolf Hitler and the inner circle of Nazism on April 25, 1945. And so Jackson takes that job. My second topic is the work, and I will do this briskly. But while that court term is ending, Jackson in Washington, D.C. is running a mini international U.S. Department of Justice out of his Supreme Court chambers. He's building a staff. He's getting oriented to the preparatory work that's been done largely in the War Department, also a bit at State, also a bit at the Department of Justice. He's coordinating with the Office of Strategic Services and information that is gathered in the field across the European theater. He takes a trip to Europe in late May of 1945 and consults with General Eisenhower, others were now after the Nazi surrender, Hitler's suicide, etc., others who are part of this new occupation and the land and the power that Jackson will take over. He comes back to Washington, both to the court and to his job for Truman, and he writes Truman a letter on June 7, 1945. It's a very carefully drafted document. It's really one of Jackson's great legal writings. It's a state paper, and it's his explanation to Truman how I will do this job. It's released publicly. It's much acclaimed. It's a beautiful document, and it really is the blueprint, building on pre-existing blueprints for what transpires in negotiations with allies and then in the Nuremberg trial. The court term finishes, and there's a little drama at the end of that term because Justice Owen Roberts, the senior associate justice who'd been serving since 1930, says enough of this place. He was as discontented, perhaps, as Robert Jackson, but he, at age 70, has a pension now and a farm to go home to in Philadelphia or outside of Philadelphia, and Roberts walks away from the court. On June 18, Jackson, when the court has concluded its term and gone into recess, loads his team onto a plane and flies to London. And there he begins negotiation with the UK, the USSR, and France about how these allies together are going to create an international court and have a process to adjudicate the criminal guilt of the arch-Nazi criminals. Along the way, Jackson, based in Europe and really one of the leading governmental officials, by assimilated rank, a senior U.S. general also, is traveling all over the place. He's in Paris, he's in Germany, Nuremberg, Frankfurt, Berlin, Potsdam, back and forth, as part of this summer job. The conference with the Allies reaches an impasse. Largely, it's over a due process Anglo-American view of how to have a trial versus a Russian show trial, if I may, view of what should be done to the Nazis. The Russians think it's agreed that they're guilty, and it's just a matter of displaying them before the Nazis are executed. And Jackson recoils from that model and says, I won't be a part of something that is a show trial. And that impasse really paralyzes the negotiations by mid-July of 1945. Jackson makes a trip to Potsdam. In Potsdam, which is in the southwest of Berlin, but it was in the Russian sector of occupation, so in a sense it was in the USSR, Jackson consults not with President Truman, who has completely empowered Jackson to do what he wishes on this assignment, but with the Secretary of State, former Justice James Burns, with whom Jackson had served a term on the court and with whom Jackson had a good relationship. And the question is really what to do about this impasse with the Russians. Truman has told Jackson, do what you think is right, which is carte blanche to blow up the alliance that has just won World War II in Europe, or to capitulate to a show trial plan, or anything in between. Burns talks more tactically with Jackson about how to take on the Russians. And Burns talks tactically with Truman about how to talk to Stalin. The end of that process is a Stalin message down the line to his people in London, and a Jackson standing his ground in London that becomes the USSR's agreement to the American model, the due process model of creating what is named the International Military Tribunal, the world's first international criminal court. And so on August 8th, they sign an agreement creating that court. It has an annex charter, which is basically the Bill of Rights and the procedures that that court will use. And then they are heading towards prosecution. They compile a list of prospective defendants. There are strategy meetings with the international counterpart chief prosecutors. There's lots of work with Jackson and staff in London. There's a side trip that Jackson makes to Rome. He meets with Pope Pius XII. And then at the end of August, he returns to Washington, D.C. Part 3. Washington newspapers reported on Monday, September 3, 1945, that Justice Jackson would be home this week for a short stay. In fact, he had come home the previous day. He left London on August 31st, flew to Paris, stayed overnight. On September 1st, he flew to the Azores, and then made it back to Washington, D.C. And he is home, staying at his home, Hickory Hill in McLean, Virginia, for 8 nights, and working the week Sunday, September 2, through the 8 days later, Monday, September 10th. This is the gist of what Jackson does in Washington. He uses his Supreme Court chambers. He uses his Supreme Court secretary. He uses messenger and other office assistants at the Supreme Court, and he does zero work that's related to the work of the court. Instead, he is catching up on all kinds of cables and staff details that are still flowing in from Europe. He is working through the weekend of his arrival, jet lag notwithstanding, and that's Labor Day. That is VJ Day on September 2nd, when the war is won officially with the Japanese surrender in the Pacific. On Tuesday, September 4th, Jackson is communicating with Herbert Wexler, the former Assistant Attorney General for the War Section in DOJ, about the former Attorney General Francis Biddle's desire to serve as the American judge on this new international court. Wexler is skeptical that Biddle is a good pick because Biddle has been involved in a lot of the planning, and it seems perhaps a conflict of interest. Jackson generally agrees with that view. On Wednesday, September 5th, Jackson from home just picks up the phone and calls President Truman and says, "I'm back in Washington. I'm here to give an update if you have time." And Truman says, "Come on in." And so an extensive meeting occurs of Jackson in the Oval Office with the president. Jackson brings some captured Nazi documents to show Truman the caliber of the evidence that they are gathering. He describes his meeting with the Pope. They talk about who should be appointed to be the U.S. judge on the International Military Tribunal. Truman is inclined to appoint the recently former justice, now resigned, Owen Roberts. He thought he had him, and then Mrs. Roberts said, "No way." They talk about Biddle, who Truman is inclined to appoint, and Jackson sort of swallows his objections a little bit. They talk about who will be the alternate judge, and Jackson suggests Judge John Parker, the Chief Judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, if Truman is not intending to appoint him to the Supreme Court to fill the seat that Roberts had vacated. Truman says, no, I'm not appointing him to the Supreme Court, something that Herbert Hoover had nominated Parker for back in 1930. And so the recruitment of that team, Biddle and Parker, is worked out. They discuss a little bit the Supreme Court vacancy, and Truman says, I had offered the job to Robert Patterson, the Undersecretary of War, but I have pulled that back because there's going to be so much oversight scrutiny of the War Department's conduct, expenditure, contracting, etc. during the war, and Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, is going to retire, that I want to promote Patterson to be the Secretary of War. I can't afford to let him go to the court. Jackson continues to work on all of the Nuremberg-headed matters at the court. One is an interesting one on Thursday, September 6th. He calls the wife of a senior member of his staff who is vital for the future, but experiencing real difficulties with alcohol back in London and back in the European theater. And they discuss, quite frankly, drying the man out and sending him for some rehabilitation, and their shared desire that he get back on the beam and be able to do the job, which he was able to do. Jackson's again working on Friday, September 7th. He's calling and then visiting Truman at the White House on Saturday, September 8th. On Sunday, September 9th, Jackson writes or publishes in the New York Times Sunday magazine his cover story explaining what's been agreed at London, what this Nuremberg project will be about, what the lead charge is. And that is the charge of waging aggressive war, of starting it, of causing World War II. The article is called "The Worst Crime of All." It is another high state paper, great Jackson writing. It was composition that had been begun in London, probably continued a bit, editorial work as Jackson ripped through draft after draft in Rome, back in London, Paris, airplane, Washington, and there's some lead time, obviously, to get it in print in the New York Times. I commend that to everyone's reading. On Monday, September 10th, Jackson is done with Washington. He's embarking on his return to the European job that really is what he's doing all along. He goes to the court to pack his briefcase. He goes to National Airport. They fly to Bermuda, and then the plane breaks. So they fly back to Washington. They get the plane fixed. They fly to Bermuda, to Azores, to Paris, and on Wednesday, September 12, Jackson lands in London. That's sort of packing additional briefcases, litigation bags, I think, and then loading up staff in London and moving to Nuremberg. Part 4, Nuremberg. Well, there are many, many phases and things to say about Nuremberg. At a very superficial level, in October, the Allies file with the judges who have convened an indictment. It charges 24 principal surviving Nazis plus 6 Nazi organizations with 1, 2, 3, or 4 crimes: waging aggressive war, committing war crimes, committing crimes against humanity, and engaging in conspiracy, common plan, to achieve those crimes. The defendants are served with this indictment. They are given counsel of choice. They're given 30 days to prepare. And on November 20, the trial opens at the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg. The next day, Jackson gives his opening statement for the United States, one of the most brilliant courtroom addresses in history. Then the United States puts on its case. Jackson has a huge team, and a lot of people go to the podium. This is sort of his A team that's going to the podium, and then a lot of them leave by Christmas. And then successors include some who are superstars and some who aren't. Their evidence is largely documentary. It includes also some captured Nazi film and Allied film. It includes live witnesses who are underlings and colleagues of leading defendants in different aspects of the trial. In March, the defendants begin to put on their cases, and Justice Jackson is active in examining witnesses, cross-examining defense witnesses and defendants themselves. This includes his cross-examination of Hermann Goering, much discussed, and I would say not nearly as bad as you might have heard. It includes his cross-examination of Hjalmar Schacht, I would say worse and bumpier than his cross-examination of Goering. It includes his cross-examination of Albert Speer, which in the end is devastatingly effective. It also, along the way, includes a lot of diplomacy. Jackson is making side trips to subscribing and cooperating nations across Europe. This is a trip to Stockholm, and this is a trip to the Czech Republic and many other places. It's a Christmas time trip to the Middle East, to Palestine, to Egypt. It's also a warm weather junket, but it's consultation with British and regional diplomatic contacts. And the trial moves forward through the defense cases into the summer of 1946. Jackson gives his closing statement, another majestic courtroom speech, on July 26, and then he packs up to return to the United States. Part 5. How was the court while Jackson was away? Well, it was 8 justices, except it was 7 justices. Because remember, Roberts had quit, and then Robert Jackson departs. Truman appoints Senator Harold Burton of Ohio in September of 1945 to fill the Roberts seat. So the court is back up to 8. The new term begins that first Monday. It's the Jackson-less term of the court. And in April of that term, April of 1946, Chief Justice Stone dies. So it's a court back down to 7. In June, at the end of the term, President Truman appoints Chief Justice Vinson to fill the center chair. But it is just in staffing a very bumpy term of the court. There's also personality issues and, frankly, plain old resentments of Jackson being on the world stage. And it's a court that's not like-minded on a lot of legal issues. There are over 20 cases that are divided 4-4 that are put over for re-argument the following term when Jackson is back to create a court of 9. Jackson returns to the court in August of 1946. The first thing he needs to do is unpack, because while he was away, they moved his chambers. They packed him up in the chambers he left in September of 1945 and moved him into the former Owen Roberts chambers. And Harold Burton had moved into the former Robert Jackson chambers. And then Jackson is both thinking about whether he needs to return to Nuremberg for the judgment and cramming and preparing for the start of the court's October term, 1946. Part 6, Jackson does go back. He is there in September of 1946 in Nuremberg when the tribunal renders its judgment. Of the, by then, 21 defendants who are living defendants for judgment. 18 are convicted of various crimes, 3 are acquitted. Of the 18 who are convicted, 11 are sentenced to death, 7 are sentenced to terms of years, ranging from 10 years to life. The tribunal writes an eloquent, important judgment explaining the proper pre-existing, not ex post facto legal grounding of the crimes: aggressive war in violation of treaties, war crimes in violation of treaties, crimes against humanity in violation of national laws, moral norms and treaties, and conspiracy being an Anglo-American concept that the tribunal was using. And then Jackson scrambles back because the judgment at Nuremberg finishes on October 1, 1946, and the court's new term is about to begin just a few days later. He actually comes back to Washington, and then he heads to his home turf, Western New York, because he's committed to give a centennial celebration address at the University of Buffalo. And he does, and that's a high, important composition explaining Nuremberg while it's very fresh. And then he's back in Washington, and he's on the bench, and the first Monday of October begins the term after his absence, and he's a justice for 8 more years, 8 more terms. He never returns to Europe. He does the work of the court, but as an extracurricular matter, he burned himself on Nuremberg by pouring energy, by exhausting himself, by writing, by traveling, by lecturing, because he regarded it as the most important work of his life. Not slighting the court, not slighting the judging that was his domestic responsibility, but explaining to the audience, which is learning, which is teaching, which is self-government, both here and globally, what international law is. He regarded it as our hope, and he regarded Nuremberg, for all of its complexities, as an important precedent on which he hoped the future would build. And so all of this is an answer to something that I think is probably a question being asked all over the place, including in classrooms right now. What did you do on your summer vacation? During the court's 1945 summer recess, Robert Jackson did a whole lot, and it continued through that next term, even though he neglected the court. I'll now share my screen and very quickly work through some slides to give you some visual accompaniment for what we've just discussed. This is Robert Jackson in his robes in the pre-Nuremberg period, looking young and looking healthy and looking serious. This is where he originated. This is Jackson Hill in the background. This is the Jackson family farm that was cleared by his great-grandfather early in the 19th century, and 3 generations later, it's where he was born in 1892. This is Jackson as a Frewsburg High School senior in 1909. And this is Jackson jumping way forward as Attorney General of the United States in 1940. There was a lot to this life and to the development of the legal skill and the preparation that he used at Nuremberg. This is Jackson receiving his commission from President Roosevelt at the White House on July 11, 1941. He's now Justice Jackson. And this is the court that he joined. Chief Justice Stone in the middle. Across the front row, Justices Stanley Reed, Owen Roberts, Chief Justice Stone, Hugo Black, and Felix Frankfurter. And across the back row, James Burns, William O. Douglas, Frank Murphy, and the junior Justice Robert H. Jackson. 2 years later, when Burns concluded that court work was not for him, Jackson became number 8, if you will. On the far right is Wiley Rutledge, who was appointed to the court in early 1943 to succeed Burns, who had returned to the political branches and was working out of the White House as the domestic president, really, for President Roosevelt. This is Jackson on May 2, 1945, a posed photo in one of the court's conference rooms when President Truman announces his appointment to do the Nazi job. It had already been ongoing for a week, and Jackson has another serious look and maybe a little bit of a concerned look, because 1 week into the job, no Hitler, no Himmler, no Goebbels, no Allied agreement, no assembled evidence. He realizes what he's in for. This is Church House in the yard adjacent to Westminster Abbey in London. It's where the Allies negotiated how they would create this international court during the summer of 1945. It was 4 nations around a square table, and on the right side you see Justice Jackson in the bow tie turning the page. To his right is Wild Bill Donovan, General William J. Donovan of the OSS, who is Jackson's principal deputy. Facing the camera are the British representatives. On the left are the French representatives, and back to the camera are the Russian representatives. That was the impasse. This is the resolution of the impasse, the August 8th signing of the London Agreement, creating the International Military Tribunal. And this is Jackson back in Washington a month later, briefing President Truman on Truman's desk. And notice the full ashtray with cigarette butts. This is Justice Burton being robed as he assumes his seat on the court in late September, early October 1945. He's the replacement for Justice Roberts. So this is the court going from 7 back up to 8. And this is where Jackson, number 9, was spending the next year. This is the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, Germany. You can see the roof repair. Allied bombing did some damage, but not devastating. And this was a big courthouse with a big courtroom and an adjacent prison in the American sector of occupation. This is courtroom 600, Civilization's courtroom, the site of the one and only international Nuremberg trial. And straight on is the American prosecutor's table. Jackson is actually seated on our left with his legs crossed. This is the bench, and you see the balding head bent forward, Francis Biddle, who is the American judge. And behind Biddle, you see Judge John Parker of the Fourth Circuit, who is the American alternate judge. The London Agreement had set up a replacement system in the event a judge needed to withdraw. None did. And so the IMT for this year chose to function slightly off the books as a court of 8. They all sat through all the sessions. They all participated in the deliberations, questioning, and judgment writing. In other words, Jackson wasn't the only Article III judge who was away without leave this year. John Parker was the other one. This is Jackson at the podium, and to our left is his executive assistant during this year, his son, William Jackson, who was a Harvard Law graduate, had been a Navy lawyer for a year, and is now functioning in effect as his father's right hand, his law clerk, during this Nuremberg year. These are the defendants. They are the leading surviving representatives of sectors of Nazi power: military, civilian, naval, army, economic, prisoners, torture, banking. It is a cast of defendants that allows the Nuremberg record to teach the world what Nazism had been and done from 1933 forward, and then beginning in 1939 forward, when aggressive war making commences. This is Jackson climbing up into an airplane. I don't quite know if it's leaving Nuremberg. I like to think it is. You'll note the smile. He cherished this work, and as I said, he thought it was so valuable, but it took a toll on him. I don't think he had any idea what it would be when he signed up, but he saw it through. And this is the court that he returned to. It's now the Vinson Court. You see Jackson is now up to number 7 in the back row, because Justice Rutledge on the back row left is number 8, and Justice Burton is number 9. You'll also realize that I've not shown you a court photo of the stone court with Justice Burton and without Jackson. That is the unphotographed court. No photo was taken during that fall 1945 until Stone's death in April 1946. And so we can kind of see them in other photographs, but we don't have a photo of that court because it was not a full court, because Jackson was away without leave. This is Jackson back with his colleagues in Washington in October 1946. As I said, it was somewhat of a divided court, somewhat of a fractious court. it was also at the level of personal relationships, a quite close and connected court. And so you see Jackson on the right, and you see on the left Justice Hugo Black holding an elegant cigarette in a holder, Justice Douglas wearing a cowboy hat, the clerk of the court, Cropley, is in the middle, and Justice Burton is above Jackson's arm. And they're sharing a laugh. Nuremberg was great, complex, important service and record building abroad for Jackson, and the court did its work in a bumpy and incomplete fashion, and then it resumed being a court of nine. And Jackson had other opportunities. He didn't think of quitting again. He didn't think of pursuing political office. He did, by day, if you will, his work as a justice, and after hours, and for his remaining summers and so forth, writing, thinking, teaching about Nuremberg. I think I've left a few minutes. So thank you for your attention. I will, here's where you can find the Jackson list on my email address. I'm easy to contact. Don't hesitate. And I will stop sharing the screen, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, John. So what was public reaction to Justice Jackson's leave with kind of without leave?
Enthusiasm, I think. Collateral service by justices was not uncommon in Jackson's period. Justice Owen Roberts, for instance, in 1942, had headed the special inquiry to determine what had happened at Pearl Harbor, how the Navy had permitted this attack to happen. Chief Justice Stone himself had done spot jobs for the Roosevelt administration. Other justices had done executive branch jobs. It's all sort of against our separation of powers grain, but they were a more unified, collaborative government, and kind of had a shared sense of national service. What was different, of course, is how long Jackson's lasted. And he did try to quit the court. He offered Truman his seat when it became clear that Nuremberg was going to take a substantial period of time. And Truman said, oh, no, they're fine. They can do the work. 8 of them. It's not a hard job. And so, Jackson didn't resign. In hindsight, he thought he should have. And he thought that no sitting justice should do a full-time, substantial away without leave, or even with leave, job and handicap the court. The country, sort of had fought and won the war, hated the Nazis, loved the idea that someone was holding them accountable, and that, frankly, maybe America's leading legal figure, Robert Jackson, had that job. So the country wasn't concerned about the Supreme Court being depleted. The country was reading Jackson's white paper letter to Truman in June of 1945, and Jackson in the New York Times Magazine, and other newsreels and things that were kind of telling the story of Nuremberg, and generally applauding.
Right. And what about his colleagues on the court? Is there any documents about how they were feeling about this?
Yeah, there's probably two groups. A divided court probably voted 4-4 on this, is how I would put it. There's documented support, maybe based on pre-existing good personal relations, from Stanley Reed, from Felix Frankfurter, from the new guy, Harold Burton, from the departed guy, Owen Roberts, and over time from Chief Justice Stone. There's not any sign of support, and between the lines and in various background ways, you can tell that there's discontent and opposition from Justice Black, from Justice Douglas, and sort of following their leads from Justice Murphy and Justice Rutledge. Rutledge, let me soften. I'm not really sure that that's fair to Rutledge. But, why Jackson, not me? Why his work on my plate? What kind of legal basis is there for this project? There are different things that were part of the discontent.
So Jackson had considerable appellate experience before he went to Nuremberg. But what about his trial experience? Many have praised his opening and closing addresses at Nuremberg, but not so much his cross-examination of witnesses. Could his lack of trial experience be the reason for these uneven assessments?
I think not. Robert Jackson had a ton of trial experience. He's probably the most experienced trial lawyer to serve on the Supreme Court from his time to the present. Now, these are state court cases. These are civil and criminal cases, and they date back to the teens and the 20s and the 30s, a little bit into the 1930s because you could try cases while you were also serving in the Department of Justice. There was some sort of part-time private practice permission. And so Robert Jackson is a dazzling trial lawyer. He had tried America's case of the century in 1935, which was a civil tax prosecution against Andrew W. Mellon, which produced a complicated judgment, but at bottom line, the National Gallery of Art, which you can go down the street and enjoy, which was Mr. Mellon's donation to the country, but really settlement of this case. And so, I don't mean to equate any of that to prosecuting Nazis. What explains some of the bumpiness is that Jackson might have been rusty because he hadn't been trying cases in recent years. And as an assistant attorney general and a solicitor general and as attorney general, he'd been arguing Supreme Court cases, a lot of them, some circuit cases, a little bit of motion practice in trial courts, but no jury work, no detailed fact work. He was a lawman and an appellate guy. And then he was for 4 years a justice. And so, maybe a little rust does get into the gears. That said, Jackson has multiple witness examinations at Nuremberg, and some are A+. Some are crushingly effective. Goering, before he himself takes the stand, calls two witnesses who Jackson cross-examines, and, he fillets them. And so, the Nuremberg record is mixed. Does Jackson deserve an A+ or an A even for his cross-examination of Goering, or shocked? I would say no. But, in the end, is there ample evidence and effective cross-examination? I would say yes, despite the bumps. Does he deserve a higher grade for his cross-examination of Albert Speer? Yes, in my view.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience. If you have any thoughts on the differences between the International Military Tribunal for the Far East post-World War II and the Nuremberg Trials.
Yeah. President Truman wanted Jackson, because he's back in Washington in September of 1945 on VJ Day, so the topic is front of mind for Truman, to take on the Pacific too. And Jackson, sort of pushes back on that. The scope of the Nuremberg project, how long it was going to take to finish that, was already apparent to him. And he said, I can't, unless you want me to quit the court, I can't do this. Jackson also quipped privately, I won't do it unless you let me prosecute MacArthur. But that was a joke. And he left this to develop in other hands. Ultimately, Truman appoints a former DOJ underling of Jackson's, through MacArthur actually, Joe Keenan, to be the chief prosecutor at the Tokyo Tribunal. It was much more occupation government controlled. And so the judicial and prosecutorial independence that characterized the European work at Nuremberg, I think, was not present in Tokyo. I'll recommend Gary Bass's book, Judgment at Tokyo, which is recent and extremely thorough and a great telling of the Tokyo story. That's the source of a lot of my learning. And it really is an effort to follow in the footprints of Nuremberg, but in a context that is different and a little bit more foreordained.
Thank you. What led President Truman to select Robert Jackson as opposed to some other legal luminary? Was anyone else under consideration?
There are some memos with other names, but Jackson quickly is the lottery pick. And a number of things are going on. One is that the Roosevelt inner circle is helping the new president. And it's just 2 weeks since Roosevelt's death and Truman becoming president that he's recruiting Jackson for this job. So the Secretary of War, Stimson, the Attorney General, Biddle, the Secretary of State, Ed Stettinius, and underlings, Herbert Wexler, John McCloy, Robert Patterson. These are Roosevelt people. And Robert Jackson is a very well-known, top of the talent list lawyer in their view. He's also done things that are big case, very complicated challenges, the Mellon case being one, numerous, the Social Security oral arguments and successfully defending its constitutionality in the Supreme Court in 1937, numerous other things. Jackson is a lawyer for the toughest situation. Plus, Harry Truman loves him. Harry Truman feels that he owes his success and stature as a senator to the Truman Committee, which he chaired, which was investigating defense overruns, contract padding, etc., and was a legislative oversight success. And in Truman's view, the key to the success of the committee was a phone call he made to Attorney General Jackson in 1941, where he said, "I'm going to head this committee. Can I steal your best lawyer?" And Jackson said yes, and he gave him a lawyer named Hugh Fulton. Hugh Fulton really insisted that Harry Truman pay most of the Truman Committee budget to Fulton as a salary, and then he built a big staff and did great work. And that made Harry Truman a national headline name in 1942, 1943. It's a big part of why Roosevelt picks him in 1944 to be the running mate. And Truman has that all in his heart as he is thinking about Robert Jackson as somebody I think is great on legal judgment. Plus one more thing. Harry Truman didn't want the presidency, didn't seek the presidency, and recognized that he was an accidental president. And he wrote privately that there was really only one man in the country in 1945 qualified to be president of the United States, and that was Robert H. Jackson. And so Truman's regard for Jackson was just up at the ceiling.
Thank you. To follow up on that, how did President Truman react to the outcomes of the Nuremberg trials?
I think he was pleased. There's some complexity, which I'm going to gloss over because it's a little bit too detail-laden to dig into. They come to a quite serious public disagreement in June of 1946, where Truman picks Vinson, and Jackson, who's away in Nuremberg, is smeared quite actively by a campaign that succeeds in having Truman not pick Jackson. And Jackson then airs out some of the court's dirty laundry publicly. And Truman didn't approve of that. But he approved of the Nuremberg work and the success and Jackson's return and Jackson's judicial service. They aren't fishing buddies or poker buddies, but they are, cordial, compatible senior Washington officials for the remaining years of Jackson's life.
Thank you. Not a follow-up. Were there concerns about the safety of the prosecutors and judges during the Nuremberg trials?
Yes, in terms of two threats. One threat that I think in hindsight was quite imaginary was resurgent Nazism and werewolves in the woods, Nazis with weapons, attacking the courthouse, attacking the residences of personnel in Nuremberg. So Jackson had a bodyguard. Jackson traveled a different route from the home to the courthouse every day. Jackson often was in an armored vehicle. I think that, in hindsight, was quite imaginary. Yes, there were a couple of incidents, piano wire strung across the road, decapitated some soldiers in jeeps that didn't have a wire cutter, but there was no attempt on the life of Jackson or any senior prosecutorial official, judge, etc. in Nuremberg. The bigger threat to their lives was the caliber of airplanes in 1945, 1946. They crashed all the time. And it's quite shocking to tally up the number of near misses. Jackson flies home after the Nuremberg judgment on October 1st, 1946. And one of the stops coming back is, I think, Gander. And the next day, an Army plane in fog flies into the cliff, and everybody on board is killed. For this reason, Jackson, as much as he could, as he explained in a letter to his wife and his daughter, refused to fly with his son to minimize the number of widows in one family. And so when Jackson returned to Washington, for instance, in September of 1945, Bill Jackson remained in London, and cable traffic and communication and trial preparation and so forth. And then when Jackson flew to Nuremberg, separate plane, Bill Jackson with other staff members and so forth. You know, planes crashed. It wasn't that they were shot down, it's that they had engine failure. Robert Patterson, who I mentioned, the Secretary of War, also a Second Circuit judge, etc., died in an airplane crash in New Jersey in 1950 or 51. So aviation was the danger.
Yes, thank you. Did Justice Jackson need a crash course in international law? Did he have staffers specifically prepping him on the international law aspect of what he was doing?
Both. He had some familiarity and had done some work, if you will, as Attorney General, even as Solicitor General in the realm of international law. And in those times, the issues are war assistance to Great Britain and navigating through neutrality acts and other things. That's some of Jackson's legal work. And he, in that time period, is consulting with American academics who are leading international law figures. Also, that's when he meets Hersch Lauderpacht of Cambridge University, who is a leading British international law expert. Lauderpacht later ends up being a part of the British Nuremberg preparatory team and sort of a legal advisor at Nuremberg and so forth. So Jackson isn't a total neophyte, but he does need a crash course. He does need assistance. On his team, his prosecutorial team at London and continuing at Nuremberg, is a State Department lawyer, Catherine Fite, one of the few women who had a senior position, who is a treaty law expert. And really the international law theory of the case is treaties outlaw war, and then the Nazis embark on aggressive war anyway. That's the international law landscape. And so Catherine Fite is an expert. And others in the Jackson team, a group of Army JAG Department lawyers, are treaty law experts. And the French and the British, even the Russians, they all, there's a lot of conversation and a lot of collaboration across these prosecutorial teams. And there's pooling learning. Does Jackson become, like the equivalent of Hersch Lauderpacht or fill in the blank today, international law expert? By no means. But the issue he was dealing with was fairly simple. And if it was novel, they got it done. And if it was dubious, they still got it done. And that became a precedent in international law going forward.
Thank you. What has surprised you in your research in the archives? What nugget struck you as, wow, I didn't know this was going to be here, and it pushed you in a new direction?
Oh, there are so many. I mean, they range from, cute little anecdotes like the guy writing to Harry Truman saying Jackson should be fired for absenteeism to, really quite fundamental circumstantial cases where you can see his knowledge and his thinking develop. One thing that none of them fully comprehend, and this is, in hindsight, a tragedy and worse, is the enormity of what we call the Holocaust. They knew about concentration camps. Those were inside Germany. They were for political enemies. The Red Cross visited them. The New York Times covered them beginning in 1933 and forward. But they applied that label to every Nazi confinement facility. And they knew the conditions got bad and killing occurred and so forth. But coming to understand exterminationism and that the camps in the East with their sorting platforms, or not even a sorting platform, just the path to extermination, were different than concentration camps, is something that is a dawning realization. And you see in Jackson's letters home to his wife, to his daughter, to some of his Washington staff, his own shock and his own trauma. One of the scenes, if you will, that captures this for me is that he's on one of his side trips, and a woman presses a piece of paper in his hand. And it's the name of her son, who she says was last seen on a train going to Auschwitz. And she asked Jackson to try and figure out if her son's alive. Well, of course her son's not alive. He's one of over 1 million people who perished in Auschwitz. But Jackson comes back to Nuremberg and actually sends a memo to somebody who's an interrogator to ask a prisoner to try and figure out, has he ever heard of this, one random man who was exterminated? And the answer comes back, never heard of the guy. And Jackson writes a heartfelt letter back, to this woman in this not even a fixed address location. So it sort of shows his brain and his heart and his spirit grappling with this issue. It's in the opening statement. It's much more pronounced in his closing statement.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Can you discuss how his Nuremberg experiences impacted him in the remaining years of his life?
Well, he had a bad heart. He'd had heart trouble before he went to Nuremberg. And I think, certainly the stress, the, kind of crummy diet, et cetera, of Nuremberg couldn't help. And so probably it shortened his life. I think it made him, as a legal matter, much more attuned to the dangers of executive power. And Professor Kim Shepley gave the Robert Jackson lecture in August at Chautauqua Institution and talked about this. The Jackson who is the 1930s, 1940 pre-Nuremberg Justice Jackson is the Roosevelt administration lawyer. And he did a lot of defending executive power and creatively lawyering executive power. And he's not a rubber stamp about executive power when he's on the Supreme Court before Nuremberg. He dissents in Korematsu, for instance. But he comes back from Nuremberg, I think, having seen up close both Nazis and Russians, meaning Soviets, meaning totalitarianism of two types. And he is a much more sort of parliamentary government, congressman, than he was before that experience. And I think this all comes home in his concurring opinion in the steel seizure case, Youngstown Sheet and Tube versus Sawyer, where he's one of the 6 votes against President Truman's, in Korean wartime, use in good faith of executive power to keep the steel mills open. Jackson says, private property, congressional authorization, there are a bunch of things here that are required before a president without an enumerated power can just do the right thing, even if he's a good guy, even if he's well-intended, even if it's wartime. So I think that's a fundamental change in Jackson due to Nuremberg.
Thank you for this engaging and illuminating conversation on an aspect of the Nuremberg trial and Justice Jackson that has not been fully explored or understood previously. We look forward to your books when they become available. Our next virtual lecture is a week from today, September 17th, when former Solicitor General Noel Francisco and the Society's Executive Director Jim Duff will have a Constitution Day conversation on the role of the Solicitor General of the United States under the Constitution and the rule of law. Registration is now open on our website, www.supremecourthistory.org. Thank you again, John, for joining us. We are adjourned.